Tonight, we are going to be exploring the complicated terrain where religion, politics, gender, and sexuality meet. The four panelists will be speaking from their areas of particular expertise, each helping us to see from a different vantage point how transnational and non-governmental Christian organizations, and I just have to confess that I was rather enjoying rethinking traditional ecclesiology in thinking about the church as a transnational, non-governmental Christian organization. They don't talk about that way in antiquity. But how these kinds of organizations have an impact on legal and social policies around the world. This question is critical at our contemporary moment, and examples abound. The involvement, for example, of the notorious US-based Christian organization known as the Fellowship or the Family in Uganda, where legislation has been introduced calling for the execution of people found guilty of homosexuality. The ongoing role of the Catholic hierarchy in shaping healthcare policy in the United States and other countries, which involvement weighs more heavily on women and gay people than on others, and so on. But as someone who works primarily on the first centuries of Christian history, I can't help but want to remind us, as we talk primarily about the contemporary moment, that the imbrication of Christian rhetoric, reasoning, and activism with understandings and lived experiences of gender and sexuality actually has a very long history. The earliest Christian archive that we possess, the letters of Paul, written in the middle of the first century of the Common Era and preserved in the New Testament, testify to the centrality of gender and sexuality as fields and tropes for working out the contours of proper Christian identity. When early Christian writers sought to malign their perceived opponents, pagans, Jews, and heretics, they often turned to the rhetoric of sexual slander to do so, as the work of scholar Jenny Knust in her wonderful book, Abandoned to Lust, amply demonstrates. Meanwhile, Orthodox Christianity's other, in other words, was recognizable to these authors because the religious deviance of Christianity's others was mirrored by their purported sexual deviance. As the early church sought to expand its reach, interventions into the sexual lives and practices of the missionized were central to the spread of the gospel. Meanwhile, sexual renunciation was the sine qua non of Christian identity for several centuries, and the disruption of domestic relations that resulted from it should not be underestimated, nor should the anti-family values of early Christianity be ignored. Centuries later, European expansion and the colonial encounter, steeped as they were in Christian triumphalism, often saw the terrain of sexuality and gender as a particularly important site for the project of Christianization. Meanwhile, utopian Christians at different moments in history have seen this terrain as a critical space for imagining alternative social realities. In the 19th century in the United States, for example, Shakers, Mormons, and the followers of John Humphrey Noyes, a Christian socialist who founded the Oneida community in upstate New York, all signaled their powerful social critique and theological convictions by introducing innovations into the sexual lives of their members: celibacy for Shakers, polygamy for Mormons, and my personal favorite, free love for the Oneida community. So, sexuality and gender are not epiphenomenal to the project of Christian social formation and outreach, but rather integral to them. And hence, this panel will explore some of these effects of the social formation and religious outreach in contemporary transnational contexts. The speakers on tonight's panel are what I would describe as a true dream team of young scholars, all working on terrifically interesting projects. And I want to introduce them all to you in the order in which they will speak. So first, Jordan Alexander Stein, who is Assistant Professor of English at the University of Colorado at Boulder, specializing in early American literature and queer theory. He recently co-edited a special issue of the journal Early American Literature on methods for the study of religion, and he's currently completing a book on the place of sexuality within the transatlantic circulation of Protestant religion and print media in the 17th and 18th centuries. His presentation tonight draws upon his expertise in this important and formative period of American history and will focus in particular on the problematic of temporality, looking at the ways in which Christian colonial Americans thought about, wrote about, and engaged with time, and how these various ways of organizing time simultaneously betrayed anxieties about the sexual and sexual reproduction, and that also contributed foundationally to the success of the colonial enterprise. Our second speaker, I have these notes in the wrong order now because we changed the order, is Hui Judy Han, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in geography at the University of British Columbia. Her current book project focuses on her dissertation field research, looking at contemporary Korean American evangelical missionary movements across several mission destinations, including the China-North Korea border, Uganda, and Tanzania. The project explores the intersections of the politics of mobility, humanitarianism, and notions of development. Her presentation tonight will explore transnational conservative Christian networks, focusing in particular on the mobilizations of homophobia, in particular something called the Holy City movement, led by South Korean Christians, and the recent rise of anti-abortion politics led by conservative Christian doctors in Korea. Our third speaker is Eng-Beng Lim, an assistant professor of theater at Brown University, my alma mater. He specializes in theater, drama, and performance studies with a focus on transnational Asian and queer issues. His teaching and research areas include critical and performance theory, queer and racial performance, and international drama. He's working right now on a book titled Tropic Spells, Performing Queer Encounters in the Asias, that examines how the queer erotics of colonial encounter inform Asian performance in a global perspective. And he has quite a provocative title for his presentation this evening, Asia's Sarah Palin's, the faux feminist religious drag show. I can't wait. Our final speaker is Mary Jane Rubenstein, who is assistant professor of religion at Wesleyan University, as well as a core faculty member in feminist gender and sexuality studies at Wesleyan. Her first book is the dazzling Strange Wonder, The Closure of Metaphysics and the Opening of Awe, and she is currently working on questions of cosmology and dark matter. Did I get that right? Physics and theology. She's published several very important articles that intervene in the current debate within the global Anglican communion over issues of gender and sexuality. And her presentation tonight draws upon this work, in which she will be inviting us to complicate our understanding of the political stakes and relationships that are activated within this debate, especially asking us to dispatch the conventional journalistic perspective that what is happening in the Anglican Communion simply pits purportedly right-wing Africans against the more liberal First World of the UK and the US. So each of the speakers is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and I've introduced them all now, so they'll just come up here and speak. And then we'll have a short exchange among the panelists that I hope will draw out some of the themes that have come out of their different talks and how they intersect. And then we'll want to open it up for the audience to raise questions and comments and so on. So that's the plan. And so I want to invite Jordan to come up and speak first. Thank you.
Thanks to Elizabeth for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to the Barnard Center for Research on Women for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. And I'd like to say thanks also to the staff at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, including Lucy Traynor, Pam Phillips, Janet Jacobson. I'm also just delighted to be on this panel with these people. We've begun having a terrific conversation over email, and I expect the rest of our conversation this evening will be equally enlivening. I'd like to begin tonight by noting that though I have devoted the better part of the past 15 years to the study of sexuality, I'm still not exactly sure what sexuality is. I'm somewhat relieved to say, however, that in this particular I am not alone. Many scholars who have been engaged with the study of sexuality for longer than I have, and whose work is perhaps more penetrating than mine is, have been similarly unable to offer a succinct definition of sexuality. In what is arguably one of the most read and most influential books on the subject, the first volume of Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality doesn't attempt a definition of what sexuality is at all. Instead, Foucault understands sexuality as an effect of power. He speaks of the deployment of sexuality. And one interpretation of Foucault's work is that wherever we find sexuality, we will also find a complex and distinctively modern cluster of other social and political forces. Now, I was long ago persuaded by this reading of Foucault's work, and so as I embarked on my own research into the study of sexuality, I began to try to understand some of these other social and political forces with which sexuality gets clustered. This, however, led to a further challenge, namely that while there is some scholarly agreement that sexuality names something greater than the sum of its parts, there is almost no consensus among scholars about how best to identify those parts. What we understand sexuality to be an effect of, in other words, seems to depend on the social and political conditions in which sexuality is being deployed. I'll give you a few quick examples. They're all kind of methodological examples, but I think they demonstrate the point. In the first place, Charles Taylor's study of modern secularism understands sexuality as something that happens when desire, morality, and a sense of integrity come together. For Taylor, those are the parts. Those are the parts, the sum of whose greater sum is sexuality. That's what I'm trying to say. Whereas David Halpern's methodological investigation into the history of homosexuality makes a related but fundamentally non-identical claim that modern sexuality is a unity among inclination, preference, and action. So Halpern also sees sexuality to have components, but he understands different components. To give you a third example, and admittedly this is my favorite of the three, Lauren Berlant, in a recent essay on sex and affect, identifies sexuality as, quote, a sock drawer for anxious affects, a gesture cluster. Each of these definitions has its merits, and each is an example of the ways that scholars have located sexuality in relation to other phenomena, respectively religious history, sexual identity, or psychology. But placed side by side, these definitions of sexuality also suggest that what we talk about when we talk about sexuality will, and perhaps should, also depend on what else we're studying. I've used up so many of my few minutes lingering over this methodological challenge for the study of sexuality because I have come to see it, and I'd like to try to persuade you to see it, less as a definitional problem than as an amazing research opportunity. If we understand sexuality to be legible in the effects of clustered social and political phenomenon, then an impressive range of humanistic and social scientific inquiries stand to contribute to the study of sexuality. To put the point another way, in terms of a proposition that animates much of my research, if we cannot define sexuality apart from the social and political forces whose effect it undeniably is, we also cannot know in advance where we will and won't find sexuality in our research. Taking this proposition to heart, much of what I do as a scholar is to go and look for sexuality in unexpected places and see what I find. In order to develop this proposition tonight, for the purposes of our discussion about Christianity and the global politics of sexuality, I'd like to spend the rest of my time looking for sexuality in one unexpected place, but I think also a consequential place, namely in the pages of the Book of Common Prayer. About 2 or 3 years ago, on a research trip that was supposed to enable me to study something else, I sat down at the Burke Library at Union Theological Seminary just up the road and examined about 12.5 editions of the Book of Common Prayer. For those who aren't familiar with it, this book is a now standard Anglican prayer book, first published in 1549 and declared the only legal prayer book in England by the Act of Uniformity that same year. The Book of Common Prayer is based on the holy books of the Roman Rite, Catholic liturgical guides, and like the text from which it derives, the Book of Common Prayer outlines the kinds of prayers that one says at different events in a religious, in this case Anglican, life cycle, at morning and evening worship, at Sunday Mass, at holy days, at marriages and baptisms, births and funerals. What I began to notice as I was reading through the Burke's many different editions of the Book of Common Prayer is the incredible emphasis on the regulation of time that one finds in its pages. I apologize for the quality of the slide. This is actually a digital image of a microfilm of a photograph of a book. But it gives you this is a calendar chart that appears at the beginning of the Book of Common Prayer. So you see every month, on this page, every month is broken up into a list of days that tells you which sections of the Bible to read at services morning and evening, and if the day of the month happens to fall on a Sunday, what to do differently. Unlike almanacs or other kinds of timekeeping books, the calendar of the Book of Common Prayer can be reused year after year. So I'll show you. This is October 21st is somewhere over here, and it's telling us 450 years later we can still use this if we wanted to figure out which parts of the Bible we're supposed to read. And then this is this last slide. This is the next page. It shows you after the calendar ends, the prayer book actually begins. The 1552 edition, which is 3 years later, the 1552 edition of which the Burke has a facsimile, includes these monthly calendars directing readers towards psalms that should be spoken at morning and evening and biblical passages that should be read at certain times of year. But the 1552 edition also includes an almanac of movable feasts, telling readers when holidays such as Easter, without a fixed date in the English calendar, will occur over the next 19 years. So that's only good till 1571. The Almanac of Movable Feast Days becomes a recurrent feature in subsequent editions. By 1604, the Almanac of Holy Days is projected for the next 39 years. A 1662 edition includes charts that calculate movable feasts for 40 years and a formula to find Easter forever. Significantly, this edition, 1662, coincident with the restoration of the English monarchy after the Civil War, also includes a list of certain solemn days for which particular services are appointed, and I just want to read you these three. 1, the 5th of November being the day of the Papist conspiracy. 2, the 30th day of January being the day of the martyrdom of King Charles I. 3, the 9th and 20th day of May being the birth and return of King Charles II. Incidentally, the first American edition of 1791 just reprises all of the prayers that you say for the King's Majesty and things to make them prayers for the President of the United States. So this kind of political remediation happens in other editions. However, I mentioned the date celebrating the restoration of the monarchy to indicate that timekeeping, even in a prayer book, is a political practice. But this overtly political moment, again, prayers for the restoration of the monarchy, should not suggest that some kinds of timekeeping are more political than others. The restoration of the monarchy finds its way into the Book of Common Prayer in 1662 because the restoration is identified, as an event. It is carefully delineated in time, designated by a precise day, even as it mirrors another narratively related event, the birthday of Charles II. To designate any phenomena an event is to locate it in political time, and to designate any phenomena concerning government as an event merely reinforces the gesture. But as I suggested earlier, one function of the Book of Common Prayer has always been to manage time. As early as the first edition in 1549, well before any of the players in the English Civil War were, as far as I know, even born, the Book of Common Prayer was already designating events. And it seems an event did not have to be focused on phenomena concerning government to count as an event. Instead, the Book of Common Prayer focuses on organizing and designating events concerning life cycle, birth and death, marriage and baptism, daily and seasonal ritual. A significant number of these phenomena, such as those dealing with marriage, children, social and sexual reproduction, and arguably those dealing with affective states like grief, fall clearly into the domain that many latter-day commentators recognize as the deployment of sexuality. The event time of the Book of Common Prayer can be understood as a version of what Dana Luciano has, following Foucault, called chronobiopolitics, the sexual arrangement of the time of life. And if I had more time myself, I would develop this argument, but I'll leave it there. What I do want to add here is that some further evidence suggests the Book of Common Prayer was not in this regard unique among print artifacts of the period. One can also see the sexual arrangement of the time of life in one of the most common 16th century uses of the Bible, the inscription of baptism and birth dates in the flyleaves. This, again, I'm sorry about the quality of the slide. This is a 1599 Geneva Bible. This was owned by the Puritan divine Increase Mather. And you can see on the flyleaf page all this writing. If I show you the recto side, you can sort of make out here. He says, birth of my daughter on a certain date, baptized by me. But this kind of information is routinely written in 17th century Bibles. Hugh Amory, who had been the rare books librarian for many years at Harvard and handled more Bibles than anybody, he alludes at one point to the fact that there were people who actually wrote down the dates of conception of their children in Bibles. I have not been able to find this, but if you have, let me know. What I'm proposing is that I'm proposing that we consider that one function of religious print media in the 16th and 17th centuries was to designate and organize the eventfulness of time according to the priorities of a system of social and sexual reproduction. Part of the reason this may be worth considering is that, to say nothing further of the Bible, the scope of the Book of Common Prayer is, historically speaking, emphatically global. In the 17th century, the Book of Common Prayer was one of several Reformed texts circulating around Europe, including the Heidelberg Catechism for the German Reformed Church, the Canons of Dordrecht for the Dutch Reformed Church, and the Westminster Confession for the Presbyterian Church, which shaped the nature of Protestant confessional practices. By the 18th century, the Book of Common Prayer was on the move, leaving Europe and being reprinted by voluntary associations based in England, such as the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. According to a 1704 account produced by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the Bishop of London in 1675 convinced Charles II to fund passage for missionaries to the West Indies, where, quote, they built churches generally within all their parishes in the Leeward Isles and in Jamaica, and for their better encouragement, his lordship procured from His Majesty the royal gift of a fair Bible, common prayer book, book of homilies, articles in canon, and tables of marriage for each parish to the value of about £1,200. A 1741 catalog of a missionary's library from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel also finds an English Bible in folio, but also the Book of Common Prayer, a book of homilies, and a number of other books that are allowed for churches. So, we associate missionary work with Bibles, but it turns out Book of Common Prayer and certain kinds of other printed artifacts were bundled with them. If one objective of the Book of Common Prayer was to organize time according to the protocols of social and sexual reproduction, these protocols were arguably being advanced and spread globally through missionary efforts that printed and circulated books outside of England, in the North American colonies and the Caribbean, and later in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Now, for fear of appearing to be a poor media historian, the point I'd like to end with is just that because print amplifies the circulation of a book doesn't mean that the message of a book also circulates in any kind of even or uniform way. Though the Book of Common Prayer was a relatively early English printed book, it also, very interestingly, continued to exist in manuscript form. And this is a hand-copied Book of Common Prayer. The O there is actually snipped out of an illuminated manuscript and pasted in, so this is a cut-and-paste job. But the Book of Common Prayer was a relatively early English printed book. It also continued to exist in manuscript form, where the manuscript copies are taken from the printed source rather than the other way around. Though an important artifact in the global circulation of Christianity and at least some forms of sexuality, the precise politics of the Book of Common Prayer is a subject for further research. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
As I started preparing for this presentation, it changed a little bit. So the Holy City movement and the abortion politics, I'm probably not going to get to. Sorry about that. Oh, this does move. So bear with me. Many of us recognize that there's an obvious imprint of US-style conservative evangelical Protestant Christianity at work in a number of international contexts on issues of both gender and sexuality. Through political networks, US aid policies, conservative evangelical influences are felt in the restriction of women's reproductive freedoms, the promotion of heteronormative patriarchy, and the shift in the focus of course, the HIV/AIDS prevention from condom distribution to abstinence. The question is, for me, is how do we then theorize some of the material ties that bind a transnational circulation of ideas and practices? And in this case, a set of evangelical attitudes towards homosexuality, especially homosexuality. And how do we conceptualize the messiness, the messy ways that people, ideas, beliefs, and theologies travel and gain traction as well as meet resistance across geography? So for the next 10 to 15 or so minutes, I'm going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind tour, beginning with the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda that's been gaining quite a bit of media coverage, and taking sort of an unconventional turn in connecting that to evangelical ties forged between Uganda and South Korea and the Korean diaspora in North America. So as many of you probably know by now, the news of Uganda's anti-homosexuality bill in October 2009, and the news just yesterday, as I was writing still, that a Uganda newspaper has published the names, photos, and addresses of 100 people it claims to be gay, with a banner that reads, "Hang them," has raised widespread concern and prompted protests worldwide. Introduced by David Bahati, a member of the ruling National Resistance Movement and an MP in the Ugandan parliament, the bill proposed, in short, death penalty for homosexuals. The 2009 anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda reads as follows, and I'm not going to read the details, but it prohibits a lot of things. Now, 10 years ago in California, nearly 300 Korean American pastors of immigrant Korean congregations got together and launched a petition campaign to qualify an initiative for the California ballot, and the initiative was called the California Defense of Sexual Responsibility Act. And not unlike the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda in 2009, this effort sought to prohibit, again, a lot of things, including the very mention of homosexuality and even the word sexual orientation, because it would imply a condoning of homosexuality as, okay. So the language was so far on the right, this petition drive, that even the Christian Coalition and the Republican Party of California denied any connection. But in the immigrant Korean American community, this was front page news day after day for over a month. And petitions circulated very widely in churches, schools, markets, in a variety of community spaces. In contrast, the white mainstream gay and lesbian groups in Los Angeles knew nothing about this because most of this was going on just in the ethnic press, for instance. And the progressives that some of us try to talk to mostly frowned and said, see, the Christian right is infiltrating the community. That analysis was of little use for those of us who grew up with homegrown homophobes and conservative evangelicals within the immigrant Korean American community. And so we ended up forging really interesting straight gay alliances with other Asian Americans and immigrant community activists. And as expected, it failed to qualify as a ballot initiative. But as we feared, some of the momentum ended up delivering votes. Actually, a whopping 72% of Korean Americans voted against same-sex marriage in 2000. And again, in banning same-sex marriage in 2008. 72% in 2008 was the statistics. Now, my interest in conservative religious formations began partly from this firsthand sort of frontline experience of organizing against the immigrant Korean American Christian right, because much of the discussion around ethnic churches at the time talked about ethnic churches as quite simply a positive space where people gather to get help, to build social networks. It's a coalescing congregational space. But I really wanted to look at some of the political geography and the kinds of power dynamics and the politics actually that get produced and incubated in these spaces. So in the US and the UK media too, interestingly, the concern over the bill in Uganda has come to focus on the influence of conservative American evangelicals. And when it was reported, as Elizabeth mentioned, that Bahati had connections to a group in DC called the Fellowship, which a lot of people have described as, this secret fundamentalism at the heart of American power. So there's a lot of sort of secret, evil conspiracy sort of talk around this. But the interesting thing for me is that the dominant conceptual framework here is not only racialized, straight man's burden, really? But it also relies on the political economic language of the core and the periphery, where the core exports and the periphery imports, often by obligation. And this sentiment is captured succinctly in titles like exporting the American gospel, exporting homophobia, etc. I take a slightly different approach. As part of my research on conservative Korean Christianity, with a focus on Korean American short-term mission trips, I went to Uganda and Tanzania in 2006 as an ethnographer, and I participated in events like prayer rallies, calling for abstinence, workshops extolling the virtues of wage labor, lots of, yeah. So the motto is like, you don't work, you don't eat. These were the slogans we were shouting in sort of missionary-led economic development seminars. So lots of stories there. But the mission trip, just to tell you a little bit about it, involved 150 South Koreans and Korean Americans in a month-long program. That's to prove that I was there. And the mission trip was devoted to bringing together Korea and Africa under the wings of God, with the itinerary including Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Uganda, and concluding with an optional tour of the Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. Safari. The participants ranged in age from 15 to 70, with more than 2/3 being women, and it was a mix of South Korean and Korean American participants. And in total, the missionaries spent an estimated $1.5 million in travel and other program expenses in this month-long series of programs. And now, a lot of those details are actually quite similar to other kinds of short-term mission trips, not just Korean American ones, but also other American church-organized mission trips. But some of the differences that I'm going to focus on are particular to Korean Americans. Now, typical of religious and humanitarian projects that use aid and relief provision as a vehicle for proselytizing, the missionaries visited churches, schools, and orphanages and handed out candies, school supplies, medical supplies. And typical of Korean evangelical spaces, the mission also followed a very rigid age-gender hierarchy in every respect. The elderly men were fed first, they spoke first, they got the best beds, followed by the older women, then the younger men, then the women. And I learned that, one of the things that I learned on this overseas short-term mission trips was that it actually, in some ways, the time aspect, the time and space of the short-term mission trip actually intensifies internal structures of power, privilege, and hierarchy, and the everyday management and regulation of travel logistics and rhetoric of differentiated labor along age and gender lines meant that the women would lead, for instance, Christian motherhood workshops to the wives of local pastors, while the men taught leadership and work ethic in economic development seminars. As an English-Korean interpreter for a delegation of high-level Christian politicians from South Korea, I also had access to closed meetings for the International Christian Business Association for Men and Women, meetings with mayors, members of the cabinet, the Supreme Court, officials at the National Electoral Commission, and dozens of legislators attending now infamous breakfast prayer meetings at the Ugandan National Parliament. In these meetings, the South Korean and Korean American missionaries saw nothing wrong in telling Ugandan politicians that Uganda actually made them nostalgic. They often wept, saying that Africa was just like Korea 50 years ago. And they wept with stories of personal stories of development, overcoming poverty and becoming Christian, and had no qualms boasting that the capitalist development and Christian church growth, as seen in South Korea, were one and the same thing. One of the distinct features of Korean-led missions like this was that the missionaries embraced a vocabulary of historical commonality and developmental solidarity between Korea and Uganda, and actually all of Africa. They drew from the Korean history and emphasized particular aspects to make this argument, reducing Korea simply as a model of success and a blueprint for all of Africa to follow. And secondly, Korean missionaries shrug off any questions of colonial complicity. They maintain that they have nothing to do with colonialism or the legacies of imperial European Christianity or the neocolonial American evangelicals in intent or practice, and insist that the Korean missionary position is fundamentally non-colonial and non-Western. They, in fact, see themselves as better suited to proselytize than white Americans and Europeans precisely because, as several missionaries said to me, Koreans are neither the West nor the rest. They're not racist like the white people. They would say, you'll never see Europeans or Americans getting their hands dirty, working alongside Africans, or sitting on the floor, or eating with their hands. But Koreans don't mind, and this is why we can, do this work better. I haven't really proved or disproved that thesis, but I'll follow up on that at some point. In a roundabout way, I'd like to bring this back to immigrant Korean communities in the US and the conservative evangelical Christianity that dominates the cultural, political, and economic landscape of the Korean American community today. It's one thing to imagine that the US is exporting homophobia as though it's a neat and perfectly mobile set of ideas and policies. But the reality is far more complicated. The reality is that the same group that went to Uganda with me in 2006 go year after year. And I can only imagine what's going on this year and next year in the midst of what's going on in Kampala, and what sorts of prayer rallies that they'll be participating. And these are Korean Americans participating in this. So some of the missionaries that I researched, the way that they articulate sentiments of affinity and solidarity with the developing world, and especially in Uganda at the time. And at the same time, they put into motion a set of conservative ideas and practices that not only is about exporting certain sets of ideas, but also reinforcing the ideas that they have within the group. So in our imaginary about sexuality and religion, I think some of us have become attached to a kind of a Midas touch paradigm of America's toxic influence, as though everything the American religious right touches instantly turns to hate and homophobia, as if the US is the source and the answer to homophobia, both a contaminant and a civilizing force. If we pay a little more attention to scholars of transnational migration who have argued that, for instance, the paradigm of permanent migrant settlement has given way to all sorts of new patterns of messy and temporary and circular migration, we might think of this global circulation of Christianity and the associated ideas and practices as much more than core to periphery, export and import, and stop thinking of the world as just a stage for the US evangelical right to ruin, and the people mere puppets. That would be not only offensive, but I think supremely unhelpful, really, for those of us who are trying to build a more critical and positive space in our own communities and families. Thank you. Oh, just one last thing. I didn't think I had time to do this. When I came back from the trip, there was this protest going on, literally right outside my building. I had just moved to Vancouver, and it turned out it was a group of Chinese and Korean evangelicals protesting the inclusion of queer-friendly curriculum in British Columbia. So it was quite an interesting coincidence.
Good evening. You know, when Jenna and I spoke about this panel over a martini at last year's LGBT Cash Bar, I was instantly recruited. I really want to thank her for being such a force behind this panel, and also for making this a reality together with Elizabeth Castelli, helping to conceptualize the panel and every step of the way being such a wonderful inspiration. Also to Pamela and Lucy for superb logistical and administrative support. You know, I really like this space. It really makes me feel like I'm being cradled in Diana's womb. And it feels good. Maybe that's the concept. Well, the story that I'm going to tell you is about the Christianization of Singapore by a family of Chinese women with a forceful agenda against homosexuality. By telling this story, we might begin to understand the confluence of post-colonial, evangelical, and statist formations vis-a-vis global homosexuality as a problematic on the one hand and creative capital on the other. Law professor and former nominated member of parliament Theo Lee Ann, her mother Theo Su Min, a former dean of law, and their extended family are the main characters. I'd like to work this story through 3 scenarios, but I'll probably only have time for one this evening, and that is Theo Lee Ann's infamous speech in the Singapore Parliament, where her eminently quotable diatribe against homosexuality includes, quote, "Anal sex is like shoving a straw up your nose," unquote, and, quote, "Diversity is not license for perversity," unquote. There's more coming, but we'll leave it till the end. The second scenario involves her mother, Theo Su Min. Theo Su Min's covert takeover of a prominent local feminist organization, AWARE, which stands for Association for Women, Action, and Research, a prominent local feminist organization, by implanting her operatives into the organization, what she calls agents of God, and took over the leadership of the organization because she was very disgruntled with their what she perceives to be a pro-gay agenda. In fact, the pro-gay agenda was simply a comprehensive sex education pamphlet that was disseminated to secondary schools in Singapore, where a range of sexual practices were delineated neutrally. In other words, anal sex was described, homosexuality was described as just another option. And she was completely startled by the characterization and said, quote, "Hey parents, you better know what's happening. You better know what's happening. I talked to parents. I said, you better do something about this. Otherwise, your daughter will come back and say, Mom, I want to marry my girlfriend. Or your son will say, Dad, I want to marry my boyfriend." So on the basis of that, she sent her operatives into this organization and implanted them and stunned the organization when all her operatives were voted into office. And it became a big event, national event, when it was found out that she had done so. Okay, so that's the second scenario. And the third scenario is probably one that some of us here are familiar with, and that has to do with the controversy surrounding Professor Theo Lee Ann's appointment as a visiting global human rights professor at NYU's law school. And there was a lot of protests. The New York Times covered the whole story, and many people were up in arms against her appointment. And finally, she didn't come, and she said that she was being bullied into submission by gay militants from the West. Okay, so those are the three scenarios. Now, I'm casting these conservative women as Asia's Sarah Palins in a performative drag show to foreground their cross-gender identification as religious white men and local state patriarchs while fashioning themselves as feminists who may or may not make sense as feminists, but the point is they're proud and religious. They're impervious to alternative positions other than their own, but have an unshakable self-belief as rational, fair, and balanced. When heteronormative and religious institutions are called out for their bigotry or exclusions, they feel personally aggrieved and assaulted. To be clear, these women may not necessarily identify with Palin or even know who she is. And they may not even follow the stakes of decolonizing feminist projects. These kinds of unknowingness or incoherencies are precisely a kind of Palin effect, a shorthand for a blend of obfuscating center to far right rhetoric and action, often contradictory but unified in their religious fervor. But the story is not about Palin per se, but the rise of conservative women warriors in the global public sphere who are very hung up over homosexuality. In the case of Singapore, this story is a rather peculiar one because Christians constitute only 15% of the country's population, about the same percentage as the Muslims, well behind the majority belief in Buddhism and Taoism combined at 51%, 15% profess to have no religion, and 4% Hindus. The murmur on the street is that born-again Christian Chinese men control the Singapore cabinet and the upper echelons of the government, providing the conditions of possibility for female proselytes or unofficial government conduits like the Theos. Singapore does not have a history of state-enforced proselytization, and I do not think that this is the state's agenda by a long shot. I'm also not sure that we are dealing with the singular legacy of a colonial missionary project. After all, as the demography suggests, Singaporeans have not embraced Christianity in over 140 years of British colonial rule from 1819 to 1965, though it is increasingly the chosen faith of the educated and the professional class. What I think bears closest scrutiny is the rise of evangelical female vigilantes such as the Theos, who've received part of their education abroad and are part of the political and professional elite in their country. They are a global movement with Palin and her sorority in the mix. It bears to note that in Singapore, both race and religion are prohibitive topics in a way that sexuality isn't. Theater, for instance, is saturated with a permissive queerness. In fact, it was so saturated that Time Asia called Singapore Asia's new gay capital. And if you have pink dollars to spend, then head over to the Lion City. Those were the headlines. And for a while, people are so disgruntled with the saturation of queer theater that the question to ask is there something non-gay to see tonight? But those were the good old years. That was the beginning part of the millennium. So theater is saturated with a permissive queerness, but race and religion are considered highly sensitive and scrutinized closely for inflammatory portrayals. This regulation is part of a state-sponsored multiculturalism that is widely seen to have succeeded in promoting multi-religious and multiracial harmony for one of the world's freest economies. Celebrations of multicultural diversity have seen its better days in the West. Just this past weekend, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says, quote, "Multicultural society has failed because we feel tied to Christian values. Those who don't accept them don't have a place here," unquote. Merkel was weighing in on a public debate that the country was being made, quote, "more stupid by poorly educated and unproductive Muslim migrants, unquote. The community in question is the 2.5 million strong Turks, whose assimilation into German society is no longer a soft request, but a state demand. Apart from Christian conversion, they must master, quote, the language of Goethe, abandon forced marriages, and speak German fluently without an accent, unquote. As startling as this ethnocentric and xenophobic position may sound from a European state leader and a white Christian woman, positions with deep colonial histories of violence and complicity, its enunciability foregrounds an age where far-right attitudes are seemingly unencumbered by critiques of colonial racialization or gender. These two topsy-turvy, multi-culti examples are symptomatic of a very particular national predicament in the transnational world, and should give us pause on exotic indictments about Singapore's authoritarianism as the only possible analytic of its regulatory power. Rather, I argue that Singapore's Christianization is reflective of a neoliberal, equal opportunity religious modernity produced by US evangelical speak, elite post-colonial education, and an all-encompassing nationalist consciousness that is able to hijack feminist positions and progressive politics in the name of the father, the state, and the father state for the common good. The deployment of women as its operatives is in this sense a strategic move, since the political mandate is already so male-identified. But the Theos are hardly a softening presence, taking on hardline positions to the far right of an already conservative government while staking their claim as women, their position as women. What is also notable is their agenda to suture religiosity into society's moral fabric and pedagogy. That is, by putting religion on the table for public discourse, pushing up against what they see as a facetious divide between the secular state and the religious world. While apparently advocating for all religious thought, their main investment is making more space for a very narrow set of Protestant moral values as they see it, and aligning it with the state's juridical and institutional structures. Their moral lives uphold national interest, and all arguments to the contrary are fallacies, red herrings, and sound bites without substance. But how can they possibly make such a case? What can they use to galvanize fear and outrage with precisely fallacy, red herring, and sound bites from the right? Yep, homosexuality. And here comes the first scenario. Anal sex is like shoving a straw up your nose. In her impassioned parliamentary speech against the repeal of 377A, which is the British Victorian-era statute on sodomy, nominated Member of Parliament and law professor Theo Lian enumerates a long list of sexual practices that she finds objectionable, especially anal sex, which she characterizes as a painful and disease-causing act. In one section of a long speech, which is available online if you're interested, she opines that, quote, anal penetrative sex is inherently damaging to the body and the misuse of organs, like shoving a straw up your nose to drink. The anus is designed to expel waste. When something is forcibly inserted into it, the muscles contract and cause tearing. Fecal waste, viruses carried by sperm and blood, thus congregate, with adverse health implications like gay bowel syndrome, anal cancer, etc. Acts of gross indecency under 377A also covers unhygienic practices like rimming, where the mouth comes into contact with the anus. Consent to harmful acts is no defense. Otherwise, our strong anti-drug laws must fall, as it cannot coexist with letting in recreational drugs as a matter of personal lifestyle choice, unquote. Theo's voyeuristic gaze on the anus both channels and exceeds the pornographic fantasy of explicit anal sex by staging the scene of insertion as a kind of torturous medical nightmare. Anal sex is thus like shoving a straw up your nose, as the forcible entry causes, quote, the muscles to contract and cause tearing, causing a reservoir of, quote, fecal waste viruses carried by sperm and blood, unquote. More than that, it has adverse health implications like gay bowel syndrome, anal cancer. Now, the mixture of misinformation, righteous outrage, and sexual fantasy is spectacular in itself. Yet, it is only by sensationalizing sex acts as dirty little secrets that her campaign to inspire moral revulsion against sodomy can have traction. In this regard, we might stage Theo's anti-homosexual antics alongside her equally, if not more infamous Ugandan counterpart, Pastor Martin Sempa, who has actually used pornographic visual aids to make the same point. Under the cover of outrage, do you know what they do in their bedrooms? That's a quote from Sempa. Sempa showed hardcore gay pornography in his church to intensify homophobia, taking the colonial version of buggery to a whole new level. Like Theo, Sempa vigorously supports punitive anti-gay bills, though he goes a step further, advocating for death penalties on top of existing draconian punishments. In his sexually graphic sermon, Sempa would describe pictures of gay porn with the same kind of helpful precision that Theo uses on the anus. Quote, this one is eating another man's anus, unquote. Both are seemingly incredulous about rimming, as if rimming is not a readily available practice in any sexual encounter. As Theo would earnestly explain, quote, rimming is where the mouth comes into contact with the anus, and it is unhygienic because the anus is designed to expel waste, unquote. Thanks for the lesson. The spectacle of sexual fascination by anti-gay proponents is often ludicrous, if not for the grave and violent repercussions accompanying their forceful advocacy for gay criminalization or even death, as in the case of Sempa. As post-colonial subjects, Theo's and Sempa's evangelical activism disavows the explicitly racialized dimensions of a penal code introduced by the colonials while claiming religious morality as a universal standard. By nativizing the code, they claim ownership under the cover of Asian values or an anti-West crusade. In the case of Singapore, since there are two subsections, 377 and 377A, the crux of Theo's argument must hinge on sexual preference and a baffling distinction. And the distinction is heterosexual hygiene and morality versus homosexual decadence. According to Theo, sodomy between homosexuals has a high price tag for society, whereas comparable sex acts between heterosexuals, however objectionable, have a protected moral base: family, procreation, decency, and vaginal penetration as a final act. Homosexuals, in contrast, are unsafe, promiscuous, non-productive, and dangerous radicals with a long list of agendas. Theo warns that repealing sodomy laws for same-sex partners portend the rise of the militant gay. She warns moral leaders not to be swayed by the red herrings of liberal debates. For instance, foremost in her mind is, quote, to say a law is archaic is merely chronological snobbery, unquote. Flashing her credentials as a constitutional law professor with degrees from Harvard and Oxford University, she maintains that, quote, not only is retaining 377A sound public policy, it is legally and constitutionally beyond reproach, unquote. Repealing the law will bring, quote unquote, noxious social consequences. And no one, quote, must be bewitched by the empty rhetoric and emotional sloganeering employed by many radical liberals, which generates more heat than light. There is little evidence that Singapore's culture of queer activism takes the form of Stonewall politics, but its conditions of possibility are certainly shaped by discourses like that. Ironically, it is Theo's own unexamined sexual panic that is the most aligned with Western homophobia and its preemptive denial of rights to all gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender. Following the successful lobby by Theo and others, the sodomy penal code was repealed only for heterosexuals and retained for homosexuals. This stunning discriminatory move was also endorsed as a referendum on the country's conservative Asian values. Such a legislative move was and still is a serious setback to Singapore's creative capital and cosmopolitan cachet. Its image as a global city was predicated largely on its standing for economic freedom, and its leaders have been angling for its transformation into a Renaissance city shaped after London and New York, where a diverse intelligentsia thrives on talent, cultural expertise, and enterprise regardless of race and sexual orientation. But selectively overturning an archaic penal code using a curious and anachronistic Asian Victorian argument based on an unmarked Christian morality makes little headway in that direction. Besides, it is contrary to legal and cultural trends in the world's greatest global cities. From Hong Kong to Delhi, colonial-era laws against homosexual sex have been struck down as discriminatory, unconstitutional, and a violation of fundamental rights. In fact, Delhi's High Court went as far as to say Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which defines homosexual acts as carnal intercourse against the order of nature, was an antithesis of the right to equality. Singapore appears to be backpedaling twice as hard to perpetuate discrimination. Apart from 377A, the local Christian rights campaign against homosexuality includes the same conversion therapy promoted by US evangelicals that is known as the ex-gay movement. The ironic proliferation of such US-style tactics on this self-avowedly Asian city persists even with the fall of prominent advocates such as pastors Ted Haggard and George Rakers, with their highly publicized dalliances with rent boys and gay masseurs. The preponderance of a fundamentalist Christian moral discourse, a Victorian-inflected Asian sexuality, and the pornographic Orientalist gaze on the local gay male as Asian boys add a bizarre colonial specter to contemporary queer subjectivity and oppression in Singapore. Thank you.
Hello. It is an honor to be here in this womb with all of you. Thank you very much. My deep thanks to Lucy Traynor and to Pam Phillips and Catherine Sameh and the inimitable Janet Jacobson for this invitation, for organizing the details of the event, and to Elizabeth Castelli for framing the conversation and moderating it this evening. It really is a great honor. Thank you. Just over 2 weeks ago, I spent my Sunday morning trying to get a camel up the front steps of the world's largest Gothic cathedral. If you're at all familiar with St. John the Divine, that huge, perpetually unfinished, constantly photographed structure towering above Amsterdam Avenue a few blocks from here, then this probably doesn't surprise you. They're always doing crazy things down there, and St. Francis Day is just the culmination of a generally hyperbolic and heterodox liturgical year. To celebrate the feast day of the man who loved creation, St. Francis Day opens with Native American flutes, weaves Jewish, Buddhist, and Christian prayers together with songs set to the calls of whales and wolves, runs African drummers through the nave with Martha Graham dancers, and culminates in a solemn procession of eagles and llamas, hens and alpacas, donkeys, goats, hedgehogs, and snails. The new deacon every year is made to go with a little wheelbarrow afterwards, with a little shovel and some kitty litter. This year, my little sister walked proudly up those gray stone steps and through the great bronze doors holding her corn snake, Eric. The camel was not so portable and simply refused to walk up the stairs. So we ran him around to the wheelchair-accessible entrance and sneaked him down the north aisle, looking about as subtle as that old elephant hiding in the M&Ms. St. John the Divine is the seat of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. The Episcopal Church is a member of the Worldwide Anglican Communion, or the WAC, that is really the acronym, a family of local churches planted by the Church of England during the British colonial period. And as you may or may not know, things have lately gone a bit whack in the WAC. Over the last 40 years, the majority of the Episcopal Church has developed increasingly progressive views with respect to gender and sexuality. The Episcopalians have been ordaining women since the late 70s, ordaining openly gay people for almost as long, and blessing same-sex unions here and there. These developments have provoked a massive backlash among conservatives within the church who decided sometime in the late 1990s that even if they lost the battle for the American church, they didn't have to lose it at the level of the global communion. So priests and bishops from Fort Worth, Pittsburgh, and Virginia began to target the archbishops of Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, and Nigeria in particular, looking to win support for their side of these issues. They began to pool votes at major meetings, to form networks outside the communion's formal governing bodies, and to realign American churches with conservative dioceses abroad. So an all-white, formerly Episcopal church in California might suddenly declare itself under the authority of the Archbishop of Uganda, a man whom, of course, they've never met, and who will never have any real say over what goes on in Fallbrook, California. The result of all these transnational alliances has been the rise of a powerful conservative voice in the Anglican Communion, which can claim the numerical advantage of the burgeoning Christian global South, the financial advantage of white America, and the spiritual capital of a historically colonized and oppressed people. At this point, the communion is poised on the brink of schism, and it's fairly clear the liberals will be the ones declared schismatic. The flashpoint for this growing division in the Anglican family is usually said to be the consecration of the openly gay Gene Robinson. Find him on YouTube doing one of those It Gets Better videos. Gene Robinson as Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire in 2003. It's actually a really sweet video. But looking back over the history of the communion, one can see that it's flashpoints all the way down. The explicit controversy over human sexuality, that's the way it usually gets termed, exploded at the 1998 Lambeth Conference, a meeting of all the bishops in the communion that takes place every 10 years. Famously, 1998 marked the first Lambeth Conference at which bishops from the global South outnumbered those from the global North, and the first conference at which women were present as bishops. While there were plenty of crucial issues on the agenda for those 10 days, debt relief, water rights, underfunded hospitals, sometimes and somehow all anyone managed to talk about was sex. This focus was largely a function of the conservative American Anglican Council, having spent the previous year flying potential African, Asian, and South American allies to Dallas and the Great Lakes to consolidate an uncompromising stance against LGBT clergy and same-sex blessings. At the Lambeth Conference itself, the AAC set up anti-gay headquarters in a nearby Franciscan monastery, so much for St. Francis's love of all creation. And there, American volunteers provided the bishops of the Global South with food, tea and coffee, mobile phones to communicate quickly with their American colleagues, and crib sheets that reiterated the transcontinental consensus against homosexuality. The upshot was that anyone who opposed this consensus was accused of failing to listen to the voice of the Global South. For example, when she stood up to vote in favor of the ordination of LGBT clergy, the Right Reverend Barbara Harris of Massachusetts, an African-American woman who was the Episcopal Church's first female bishop, reported being hissed at by the all-male but multicolored majority. And the whole thing came to a head when, in front of a full crowd and a number of cameras, a Nigerian bishop tried to exorcise a gay British priest, telling his demons to come out in the name of Jesus. So Lambeth 98 was a mess, but the panic over sex and gender it staged can be traced back at least to 1974, when women were first ordained to the priesthood of the Episcopal Church, and dissidents claimed the issue would split the communion. Or we could go back to the Lambeth Conference of 1930, which admitted it could find no theological reasons for opposing women's ordination, but said it could not support the practice because the church just didn't do such things. Or we could go all the way back to the formation of the Anglican Communion itself, which arose in 1867 out of the so-called Colenso affair. J.W. Colenso was the British bishop of Natal in then Zululand. He was under threat of excommunication for arguing that the Zulus, and all people, were saved regardless of their acceptance of Christianity, that polygamy was not an impediment to becoming a Christian, and that the Zulus, rather than the colonial administration, ought to rule Zululand, and that was the real problem. To coordinate the practices within the colonial churches, the Archbishop of Canterbury called the First Lambeth Conference, which came to the consensus that salvation did depend on conversion to Christianity, and that conversion to Christianity was most perfectly mirrored in monogamous heterosexual pairings, the very sort of monogamous heterosexual pairings that the colonial administration throughout sub-Saharan Africa was enforcing at the level of individual households. So, the current level of sex-crazed rancor in the communion is partly a function of this 19th century religio-sexual colonial imposition, partly a function of the complex transnational alliances I mentioned a moment ago. Unfortunately, these positions alone leave us with the impression that everything ultimately comes from the North. We're left thinking the conservative bishops of the global South aren't really fighting their own battle. They're defending a gospel that came from the North against a sexual ethic that came from the North by means of a Northern-style homophobia enforced with Northern caste. Right, this is the position I think that Judy is warning us really carefully against. But according to the bishops who've taken the strongest stances against homosexuality, their position can be said to be authentically Nigerian, Ugandan, Kenyan, Rwandan, precisely because homosexuality itself is not Nigerian, Ugandan, Kenyan, or Rwandan. To the extent that it exists in these nations at all, homosexuality is yet another neo-colonial imposition, and in fact, the most toxic imposition yet. As the recent Archbishop of Nigeria, Peter J. Akinola, once told a local newspaper, quote, "In our human existence in this world, there was a time Africans were slaves, but we came out of it. But what again followed? Political slavery under colonial administration. Somehow we came out of it. Then economic slavery. World Bank, IMF would tell you what to do with your own money and your own resources. Now with homosexuality, it is spiritual slavery, and we have to resist this. They had us as human slaves, political slaves, and economic slaves. They want to come from spiritual slaves. Now we won't accept it." Furthermore, the spread of homosexuality is said to leave the fragile post-colonial nation more susceptible to the ever-threatening Muslim incursion. Any concession to what Akinola calls the cancer of Western sexual ethics risks allowing another infection, Islam, to move opportunistically into the compromised body of African Christianity. As Akinola sees it, if he does not maintain a hard stance against sexual immorality, sexual immortality, if he doesn't maintain a hard stance against sexual immorality, then he risks losing his flock to a tradition that does. It's not clear, and it's probably not important, which came first, anxiety over virulent Western homosexuals or anxiety over violent African Muslims. What is important is that resistance against each of these reinforces resistance against the other, creating a complex Christian heteronationalism among conservative bishops of the post-colony. What is perhaps most disturbing about this heteronationalism, however, is the way it has helped its proponents and their allies to ossify the so-called Global South, and Africa in particular, into a hyper-conservative monolith. As Bishop Akrofi of Ghana told me in an interview, quote, "All of Africa is of one mind here. There can be no compromise with anyone who thinks this disgusting lifestyle is acceptable to God," unquote. But it's simply not the case that all of Africa is of one mind here. To be sure, Akrofi, Akinola, and their colleagues have condemned same-sex sex as the worst possible offense against God. To support this position, they usually appeal to a purportedly literal reading of Scripture, which in their minds transcends the particularities of culture. Scripture alone can purify the church of its decadent Western accretions. So if Scripture says a man who has sex with a man is an abomination, and New Hampshire says he is a bishop, then New Hampshire is wrong. But for Njonkonkulu Ndungane, the former Archbishop of Southern Africa, biblical literalism itself is the Western accretion, stemming as it does from a European fantasy of transcending culture. Far from de-Westernizing the gospel, Ndungane argues, biblical literalism only re-entrenches European thinking in a more sinister form. So the only way really to de-Westernize the gospel, he argues, is to call upon African culture and tradition to interpret the text. And for Ndangane, as well as for his predecessor Desmond Tutu, African culture and tradition in a post-apartheid world tell us that all people are equal in the eyes of God. A similar position has been taken up by Bishop Christopher Senyonjo of Uganda, who's currently in exile for having opposed his country's intensified criminalization of homosexuality beginning in the late 90s. But the newspapers never talk about Ndangane or Senyonjo or even Tutu in this context. Nor do they ever mention the self-proclaimed global center of Anglicanism, which includes the churches of Botswana, Burundi, Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Venezuela, and the Virgin Islands. All of their leaders, while hesitant to ordain LGBT people themselves, have expressed their wish to find a way to live with the different interpretations of sexual ethics across the communion. Perhaps more importantly, this global center includes all the members of the Anglican Women's Network, which comprises 2 delegates from every province in the communion, and which has continually and unanimously affirmed its desire to remain in communion regardless of who is Bishop of New Hampshire. The statement of their 2007 meeting reads in part, quote, "Given the global tensions so evident in our church today, we do not accept that there is any one issue of difference or contention which can or indeed would ever cause us to break our unity as represented by our common baptism." But the newspapers never talk about Anglican women either. More problematically, the communion is not listening to them or to the range of carefully considered opinions throughout the Anglican world. Rather, it has decided to draw a line in the sand and require each of its member churches to stand on one side or the other of this issue. This line has come down in the form of the recently issued Anglican Covenant, which requires those churches that sign it to, quote, "act with diligence, care, and caution in respect of any action which may provoke controversy," unquote. Such actions would certainly include things like consecrating more gay bishops or formalizing a right for same-sex marriage. In fact, in a recent interview, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, said that relations had been improving in the communion until the 2010 consecration of Mary Glasspool as Bishop of Los Angeles, and this, he said, set us back. Bishop Glasspool is a lesbian, and this is bad. The covenant warns the churches that further actions deemed incompatible with the covenant will likely result in their being excluded from the communion's governing bodies. The upshot of all this is that any province that adopts the covenant and agrees to refrain from controversial behavior will be considered fully Anglican, whereas those that do not will be considered, it's not quite clear. Archbishop Rowan has proposed that the Anglican Communion might become a 2-tiered church, with a first tier of full covenanting Anglicans and a second tier of non-covenanting, gender-confused Anglicans. These are not exactly his words. But one begins to wonder, can you heal a rift by installing it? Or reconcile factions by subordinating one to another? Can a house divided against itself stand? I'd venture that as Jesus once told his disciples, it would be easier for a camel to pass through the bronze doors of a Gothic cathedral. Thank you.
Janet was asking that while people are gathering their thoughts for their own questions, that we might hear Juhi and Mary Jane speak a bit about this similar theme that came up in both of their papers about thinking differently about the relationship between the North and the South, East and West around these kinds of issues, rather than simply seeing the contestation as an East-West, North-South divide, rather the varieties of positions being taken around the world, and also the differences in thinking about circulation, the politics of circulation as a consequence.
I'm trained as an ethnographer too, so I end up dealing with a lot of everyday practices that actually don't end up, that I have trouble making sense of in the abstract. And in some ways that's what's actually really rewarding about the ethnographic practice, because you end up uncovering things that are completely unplanned and unaccounted for. And I think just studying the circulations of missionaries, and especially the short-term missionaries, and the ways in which the time-space construction of that experience conditions the participants, I think has been my gateway into thinking about the space of circulation as not, it's the root, not the root. I mean, it's sort of the idea that the space of the circulation itself is just as important as the point of departure and arrival. So I think as I'm thinking about missions that way, I started thinking about other kinds of circulations that go along with missions. Because I mean, for example, in my examples too, what the Korean missionaries are imparting or teaching or instructing in Africa are not just what you might consider Christianity, what you might consider missionizing even. They're teaching economic development. I mean, they're teaching peacemaking stuff that's somewhat loosely based on the Bible, but not really. There are lots of other associated ideas that travel along with certain things. So if we think about homophobia that way, then could we not then complicate the picture so that we don't just blame the family, or the bunch of elites in DC as having caused this whole brouhaha.
Yeah, and just to add quickly to that, I'd say that one of the crucial circulatory devices is modern media, and the way that it functions is just baffling. So, for example, when I spent some time in Ghana talking to a bunch of bishops, any person I spoke to and said, I'm here studying the Anglican Church, they'd say, oh, it's a beautiful church, beautiful old tradition, too bad about those gays. And the newspapers would call the Anglican Church the gay church, right? So Bishop Akrofy's sense that homosexuality has to be resisted in all sort of men on deck, right, to resist it, isn't a product at all of his having been approached by anybody in Fort Worth or Dallas. It's a product of his children's being made fun of in school for having a father who's a priest in the gay church, and his wife being mocked by her Methodist and Roman Catholic friends, and her and his attempt to salvage some dignity in the face of being the subject of profound ridicule thanks to local media. So media is another way that this comes and fragments and splinters off in all kinds of ways.
I would just say that in Theo Lian's speech, she says that Singapore is an independent state, and we can decide 377A issue ourselves. We have no need of foreign or neo-colonial moral imperialism in matters of fundamental morality. So it's interesting how she seems to take on a kind of nativist position when in fact her assumptions and references are all Western. So when she talks about how she deploys whatever is convenient for her rhetoric. So she will talk about how if we are not to copy the sexual libertine ethos of the Wild Wild West, then we should. Then we should not repeal 377A. But then she will also quote, a young group of Canadians who were grieved enough to issue an online apology for, quote, the harm done through Canada's legalization of homosexual marriage, urging us not to repeat their mistakes. And she would also quote a few examples of, sort of right-wing ex-gay movement, and how these are examples that should be held up for her, for us to not repeal 377A. So it's very interesting how she is totally contradictory in her rhetorical position. It really doesn't make sense if you follow her statement, and the influences come from the West. The assumption of the Constitution, the Constitution comes from Britain. So there are all these assumptions that she's not critical of, and where it's convenient for her to be critical, she would just say Wild Wild West as a kind of shorthand to dismiss, to be dismissive about it. So.
I'll just say one thing. I can't win those arguments myself. I've tried, but at some point I have no credibility because I'm not one of them. So for me, I've actually never engaged in an argument about biblical interpretations or about what the Bible says about homosexuality or abortion and that sort of thing. Not in that kind of one-on-one context. I did actually during the 99 thing, I debated a pastor on the Korean language TV. It didn't go so well. So I'm never going to do that again. It's just, I leave that up to, I think, the progressive, the Christians in the church to actually engage and push them. But yeah, for me, it's kind of a dead end.
Yeah, this is actually fun. I get to pretend I'm an anthropologist. And in my village, in the Anglican world, which is different from the evangelical world, so the Anglican sources of authority are not just Scripture, but Scripture, reason, and tradition. And so Scripture is always sort of read through the lenses of reason and tradition. And so I would just say two quick things, one of which is that it's, in many ways, the Christian commendation to love one's neighbor and to love unconditionally that has prompted the social justice movements in all kinds of forms of Christianity, both Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. So part of what's so difficult for at least the progressives in the Anglican communion is that from their perspective, it's their gospel that has taught them to love people across differences, and they don't understand how that same gospel is being deployed to demonize particular differences. When it comes to the demonization of those particular differences, if you talk to even the most right-wing bishop on this issue, he will say, well, of course I know gay people, right? And of course I love them, and of course they're important to me, and I want them to stay in the church. The problem is when this gets ratcheted up to the political level, it becomes a problem of Islam, it becomes a problem of men looking feminized because they're in positions of power. There's a complete divide between what people will say personally, from the Archbishop of Canterbury to a sort of local priest, and what they're often willing to say on a policy level or but usually if you get anybody in the traditions I'm familiar with into a room, the person will say like, oh no, of course I don't. Yeah, there's not a really big. I love gay people. My best friends are gay. This is what you usually get. Yeah.
I think that is a difference between maybe some of the evangelical Protestant settings and the Anglican settings, because my people will never say they know a gay person or ever seen one or have come to contact with any of them.
And
while I'm talking to them, of course.
I think that, for the Theo family, they wouldn't really be interested in the nuances of biblical teachings or doctrines. That's a point of departure for them. That is a moral issue. So that for them, where they're coming from is entrenched. There's really no, debate or discussion about how it should be interpreted. It's a moralist position, and that's a position that's unshakable. So I don't know that, they would even be aware of the nuances that you just articulated, or even care about it. It's moralist, and it's a political position too that they're adopting.
Well, one really interesting thing to raise about it, have you seen the Pat Robertson's YouTube videos about transgendered Christians? So a transgendered Christian wrote to Pat Robertson and said, this is what I've come to. This is the truth I've discovered. This is his language. What do you think? And Pat Robertson said, look, if you feel in your heart like you were born into the wrong body, and and you'd like to make modifications to that to change to suit your heart, then that is fine. it's shocking. So the issue of the relationship of and that's in the evangelical, right. So the issue of transgender inclusion in churches is it's being treated in a completely different way, and I don't really know why. Transgender clergy have been accepted in traditions, that Methodist Presbyterian churches that aren't ordaining openly gay people. So that it's different from I think for the most part the issue of women who have sex with women, it's not really sex, right? So it's just not taken seriously at all. You don't get the sort of detailed descriptions of the disgusting things that might happen between women. It's just seen to be sort of a failure to grow up and straighten out or something like that. So, but yeah, I think across the board, it's men who tend to be focused on much more.
And also to add to that, the colonials don't think that women can have sex with each other, so there is no provisions on the penal code for lesbian sex, surprisingly. But Theo Leanne differs on that point. She wants to criminalize lesbian sex as well. And part of the sexual panic which erupted over the Aware saga, her mom implanting the operatives to take over the leadership of the feminist organization, is precisely because the progressives, or the old guard that were thrown off by the coup, had made some gestures towards the lesbian community by attending a premiere of Spider Lilies, a lesbian film, and this became, this made the Theo family just, it just threw them off, and they were, it caused them so much it caused so much sexual panic that that she found it necessary to stage this coup. So in the discourse of 377, even though by law, women are not included, there is talk on the street on this issue among the lesbian community as well.
There's I demur a little bit to Elizabeth, who knows more about this history than I do, but there's an incredibly rich, long Christian history of concerns about the body, bodily discipline, forms of affiliation. At some points and in some sects and some denominations, those things don't actually just concern themselves with sexual activity. They concern themselves with other kinds of bodily regulation, things like diet or abstentions or other things. It is interesting how all of that seems to matter less than male homosexuality in this moment and in these examples. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because there actually is this whole, Christianity could regulate all kinds of things. But this seems to be the one that is the push button issue or the nuclear issue at this moment. And I think, consistent with what I outlined at the beginning of my presentation, I would think that has to do with other kinds of issues, such as you point to, priorities of global capitalism, certain kinds of colonial and post-colonial concerns. I was incredibly struck by Eng-Beng's formulation, which I'm paraphrasing, but something like nativizing colonial laws looks like rejecting them. Why? That doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, from a logical perspective, but it seems in practice to happen all the time. So I think, yeah, in some ways when we talk about sexuality, we're also always talking about the other things that are making sexuality legible for particular reasons and in particular ways. And so I would, for those reasons, absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, no, you don't even necessarily need sex or sexuality to get there, and I appreciate that intervention. Yes, I mean, Christianity has, well, at least, after the first couple decades, been a profoundly globalizing movement. I mean, this is the Great Commission, right? Global Christianity is, in that particular sense, a total redundancy, I think, and I think it's what you're sensing, what you seem to be communicating is that the term global Christianity is a recent coinage to account for the extent to which Europe and North America have dwindled numerically in the face of Africa and Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So that's the issue. Of course, I have a very good friend who's a priest from New Zealand who says, am I the global South? Are we in the global South? So these terms don't. To the extent that that I was using them, these are the terms that the communion very problematically uses. But the bishops of the global South will say, "We are the bishops from the global South," and the global South says, right? But yes, no, I absolutely appreciate this as an intervention. Thank you.
That's a really productive question because it makes me think about what is meant by global Christianity, particularly in relationship to global homosexuality in a global city. All of those intersections are very complicated. In the case of Singapore, for instance, global homosexuality comes in the form of pink dollar capitalism, and the Singapore government was promoting the makeover of what is perceived in the West to be a draconian father state that is totally insipid and dour into a sexy regional cultural nerve center that uses pink dollar capitalism as part of its appeal. So you have, within a few years of this initiative in the new millennium, pink feather boa, protein shake drinking, gay boys, splash all over the tabloids, the proliferation of bathhouses, queer theater, pink real estate, Time magazine spreads to suggest that Singapore has come of age and is now sexually emancipated. And this is really interesting. It ties in with the whole idea of global queering, which is the dissemination of LGBT Western cultures, Mardi Gras parades, coming out narratives to the rest of the world and helping to liberate sexual minorities in third world countries. And there's a very complicated relationship between something like the Singapore State's initiative and a discourse like that. And also, as part of that, then how does global Christianity situate itself vis-a-vis these kinds of initiatives? And what are we talking about when we say global Christianity? Are we talking about a particular specialized group of evangelical Christians with a very narrow set of moralist issues? Or are we talking about different kinds of denominational kinds of iterations of religious initiatives? It's a really complicated question, I think. And in the case of Singapore, where it's multi-religious, multicultural, it becomes even more fraught. Who gets to have public visibility? Who gets to have certain kinds of rights? Be able to participate in civil society? All of those things are staked, in precisely a question like that.
Just to add, I agree, and I also really appreciate the question, and it is interesting listening. I'm more of a historical person, so I study how the mess gets made, and other people study how it gets cleaned up. But I think one of the things, while there was, I think, some justified anxiety that I heard in these papers, I think you're right to say that there is a way in which the language of a global Christianity is being used as a kind of solvent to national, regional, colonial, other kinds of entrenched differences. It's a way of trying to work past them, even though it produces other kinds of blockages.
And I think it's also a way to emphasize the interpretation of the word post-colonial as simply having moved beyond colonialism. I think it's, by saying global Christianity in a lot of circles, that means the shift of, the shifting of the Christianity gravity. The gravity has shifted from north to south. It's that rhetoric that it's no longer the Northern Church that's in charge of the world. It just happened. It's now they're in charge, and we respect that. It's this whole shrugging of or shirking of any accountability or responsibility.
Well, in my village, in response to the gender question, I would venture that the reason that homosexuality has been such a stumbling block for the Anglican Communion in particular, is that the Anglican Communion spent a very long time just sort of living together with our differences and not really, picking one side or another, just sort of trying to drown it all in sherry. And the issue over women's ordination that emerged profoundly in the 1970s was one of these very systematically and carefully sort of swept under the sherry-soaked Anglican rug. And so I think it's precisely because they couldn't come to terms with women's ordination. It just became, the answer was, well, in dioceses that will ordain women, they can ordain women, and in dioceses that don't ordain women, they won't ordain women, and this will be a difference we can live with. And that difference we can live with, so what this means is that, women who are bishops who show up at an international conference won't be recognized by some people as bishops. And in fact, when the presiding bishop of the American Episcopal Church, who's a woman, recently went to a cathedral in England to celebrate Mass, the Archbishop of Canterbury made her remove her mitre so that she wasn't dressed as a bishop in England, because England doesn't consecrate women bishops. England has also been trying to figure out how to make its recent decision to try to consecrate women. This is so Anglican, right? They've decided they're going to try to consecrate women as bishops, but they haven't quite done it yet. But they're resolved to try. And they're trying to make provisions for people who don't want to accept the episcopal authority of women. So what they've decided is that if you're in a parish within the diocese of a woman bishop, they're going to have at one end of the church communion wafers consecrated by a man, so you can take those if you want, because those are the sort of real ones if they weren't consecrated by women. So gender remains an enormously unsolved issue, and I think it's precisely because the church decided that it was just not going to deal with this issue, that it's absolutely sort of fracturing at the seams over homosexuality. But yeah.
Well, the gender of Asia's Sarah Palin is male. They're also male identified, that when they stake a position called post-colonial feminism, it's just mind-boggling what they could possibly mean when they stake a position like that, which is a political position that we think of when we read Jackie Alexander or Chandra Mohanty. We think about decolonial feminist projects, but they're simply saying that by virtue of the fact that they are it's a biological essentialist position. They're women, and therefore they're feminists. They're in the post-colony, therefore they're post-colonial feminists, and their project is everybody's project. So the logic is totally obfuscating. I'm not sure how really to deal with their gender when they profess a project as difficult to follow as this. So I'm confused. I'm actually confused.
I have a couple of confused thoughts too. One thing that I'll say is, I'll say two things. But first thing is, when I was doing this research, for instance, I had to perform a lot of gendered functions myself, right? So they told us, they gave us a list of things to pack, and one of them was a dress. I couldn't do it. I thought to myself, if that means I don't have access to certain spaces because I'm not wearing a dress and I'm a female, that's just something that I'm going to have to put up with. I know it seems really silly, but that was just one thing that I was not willing to do, even though, of course, I went completely into the closet during the course of my entire, my dissertation research. Something about the performing the heteronormative gender role seemed even more difficult for me. The second part that I was going to say was, among the missionaries, I actually encountered a lot of single, unmarried Korean women who were somewhat unconventional in terms of their performance of their gender roles. They would be in their 30s and unmarried, God forbid.
and sort of uninterested in pursuing the marriage trajectory, and which was interesting because for a lot of the short-term missionaries who end up becoming long-term missionaries, the men would be expected to marry and bring a wife to the mission field. For a lot of the women, on the other hand, would be expected to remain single and definitely not marry or date local men. That would be completely inconceivable. So there are these really interesting regulations that are differentiated along gender lines in all sorts of interesting ways. The gender performance, the marriage expectations, career trajectories.
I think on that note, I am charged with bringing this discussion to a close. I want to thank all the panelists for their very stimulating and important presentations.